Hello, it's Jacob again, and in this video, we will be summing up our Unit 2 and talking a little bit about why policy and market failures are so common in this world. Now, throughout this whole unit, we explored how markets fail, and there were three broad ways that they could break down. The first one involved a misalignment of private benefits and costs with society's benefits and costs. If for some reason the incentives faced by the individual do not match the interests of society, then you'll get a bad equilibrium. You get an equilibrium outcome, there's no shortage or surplus, but the quantity is higher or lower than what would be optimal for society as a whole. Then there were also situations where you don't have a competitive equilibrium, whether due to some kind of government intervention that forces the price and quantity away from where they should be, or due to a lack of competition, which, you know, means that you don't get a competitive price. And we also saw situations where a property rights regime isn't working due to a lack of excludability. The market can't ration the resource. And so either you have a situation where taking the resource denies it to others, and so you wind up with overproduction, over exploitation, as we call the tragedy of the commons, or a lack of rivalry means that people just want to free ride off of each other, and you get an under provision of a public good. We saw that each of these problems could go in two different opposite directions. We saw that each of them could come from a failure of government or a failure of the free market itself. You have situations where government intervention is the problem and privatizing or deregulating would be the solution. And you have situations where the market is the problem and you need government intervention to give the solution. And so overall, this gives us 10 failures. And we saw how market failures could be killed by applying their opposite. With policy failures, because it's caused by the government intervening, the solution is simple. You just take away the government intervention. If you don't need a price ceiling, price floor tax, or subsidy, you do without. But with market failures, because the market failures are in some ways reflections of the policy failures, they result from the same sorts of problems, just generated out of the market themselves. You would alleviate these by imposing the opposite condition. So, for example, in a situation where we have a negative externality, where private benefits are too high, the individual is not forced to account for the full consequences of their actions, we have to punish it with the tax. In situations where the individual is not being rewarded sufficiently for what they do, there's a positive externality, they have to be subsidized. And likewise, a monopoly can be controlled by the imposition of a price ceiling, and a monopsony by the imposition of a price floor. And with regards to property rights, a common resource can be privatized, and a public good can be provided publicly by the government. And we also saw some cases where failures are actually worth it. Because failure is like the opportunity cost to society of a specific policy. But we might ask, what are the gains? What are the benefits of allowing a failure to happen. And social engineering is always an option. You might say, even though this makes the economy smaller, it creates a world more like one that I want to live in. There are also purely economic reasons to tolerate failures at times too. Like when we tolerate a monopoly or actually create monopolies through patents, or when we might use a price ceiling or price floor to try to uh, actually I take that back. When we use a tax or a subsidy as a sort of rationing method, or when we have situations that could be solved, but the deadweight loss of them simply isn't large enough to warrant the cost of fixing it. Like a tragedy of the commons that is small enough that it's actually better to accept it. But we can always use economics to better our lives. And despite economic theory, policy and market failures are still extremely common. And why is that? Well, one simple reason. Good politics usually means bad business. So public choice theory was invented to merge political science with economics, but you don't have to go deep with it. And what it comes down to is two key ideas. This phrase, privatize the benefits, socialize the costs, and a concept called rational ignorance. Now, to start with, rational ignorance deals with information. So, economist Brian Kaplan, pictured in the upper right corner, was fascinated with politics. He saw people voting against their interests, he saw people voting for illogical policies, and it inspired him to write a book, The Myth of the Rational Voter. It was very controversial in its day because it seemed to strike both at one of our big political sacred cows, the idea that democracy leads to good outcomes. It does. In fact, that's the main theme of Unit 4. But it kind of struck at our faith in the common man to make decisions for himself. And it struck at one of the premises of classical economic theory, perfect information. A simplifying assumption that agents know everything relevant about a situation in order to make a rational decision. Now, perfect information isn't always used in economics, and there's entire fields that come about just from relaxing that assumption. Specifically, information economics. People don't know everything, and because of that, information itself can be a commodity, and it can play a large role in people's planning. You even get additional failures. Ones I don't talk about in this course, but you get additional failures sometimes from lack of information. But the big idea is people don't always know everything and they might make mistakes, but they try to make the best decision based on what they do know and what they know about what they don't know. People don't know everything, but they are rational. And that even applies to how they go about collecting information. And so Kaplan ended up formulating this argument. Information is costly to acquire, so people judge based on some knowledge of the world what the expected benefits are of acquiring it. I could learn more about the situation, but it will cost me to do so. Is it worth doing? And if the benefits are too low, they choose not to. Now, this applies to purely private matters like advertising. That's another way that businesses in a state of competition can survive. The consumer simply doesn't know about their competition, so they can charge them a markup. But it also applies to the world of politics. The voter is ignorant. The voter doesn't know everything about the candidates and policies that they're voting on, but they're still rational because they weighed the costs and benefits of acquiring that information. It was a rational decision for them to choose to be ignorant. Now, rational ignorance is going to play a major role in most markets. But where it ties into politics, because information asymmetries appear everywhere, there are lots of businesses where the consumer and the producer don't know the same facts, and that can give an advantage to one or the other. But where it especially ties into politics is through lobbying. See, a policy can be collectively very destructive, but individually very cheap. A small group of people, usually business elites, benefit from the policy. So the benefit is huge to them, but the public as a whole pays very little individually. And so they don't face much incentive to learn about the issue, much less protest it. And a classic example involving this is corn and sugar subsidies in the US. There's a reason why they dump corn syrup into everything. It's cheap, but it's not inherently cheap. It's cheap because they subsidize it to hell and back. Corn farmers are huge welfare queens. They get massive amounts of money from the government to keep their corn cheap, which makes it ideal filler. It makes it ideal fodder for animals. It makes it ideal filler in junk food. Just stick it into everything. Now, you, the individual, most of your income doesn't go to food, and not all of the food you buy is made of corn syrup. And even then, corn syrup's just one ingredient among many. You don't, you have to pay for the subsidy first as a taxpayer, and then you also pay for the subsidy in the sense of the wasted resources at a societal level. But it's not exactly a huge problem in your day-to-day life, is it? But for the corn farmer, it's a big deal. That's their whole line of work. Even though the corn subsidy leeches off of society as a whole, it doesn't leech off any individual people enough for them to notice. The corn farmer, it can be a matter of life and death for their business, whether or not they get that subsidy. We call this concept privatizing the benefits and socializing the costs, because private interests will lobby to get a policy passed. It could be a regulation, it could be a price control, it could be some kind of subsidy. Usually it's subsidies. Most of this is subsidies. They're going to lobby for things that pay out benefits to them, but come at the expense of society. And politics suffers from a free rider problem because government policy itself is a public good. You know that So not only do these issues impact you very little, but you also know that you individually have very little impact over them. There are a lot of people who don't vote just because they know that their individual vote won't swing an election. And so collectively, the costs of bad policy add up. These corrupt businesses can nickel and dime people into oblivion. They nickel and dime society. But individual consumers don't have the uh, the motivation to go do something about it themselves. They don't have the motivation to learn about it. They don't have the motivation to vote differently over it. Nobody has ever elected. Nobody has ever voted for a specific president just because that president promised to get rid of the sugar subsidy, or because they promised to, you know, pass some specific tiny change to the legal code. And because of that, lobbyists can get away with what they do. And what results are insanely complicated tax codes, insanely complicated regulatory codes, and all of it is written by private interests. They call this corporatism. It's capitalist in the sense that it's private property. It's a society that is that does have markets, that does have private property ownership, but big business is not at odds with big government. Big business and big government go hand in hand. People don't tend to think about that. A lot of socialists don't think about that. They tend to decry the influence of big business over government when it comes to deregulation, but they don't think about the impact it has on regulation. If you believe that the laws are largely written under the influence of the wealthy, then the proposed regulations and spending programs that you support are probably also cooked up by the wealthy, and it's not done with your best interests at heart. It's as simple as that. And this gets especially nasty when bad policies are bundled with good policies. When instead of being able to vote individually on individual issues, instead you have to vote for just a candidate or a party, right? The party might choose what candidates you're allowed to vote for. Because they can always find something more important. It kind of like an omnibus bill, in Congress, they'll have these bills where instead of having one bill per subject, they'll make a big bill that tries to cover everything. And it forces compromises, but it also gives them opportunities to just fill these bills up with junk, absolute nonsense. Congressmen, they don't want to pass a certain thing, but they'll attach something small to something big so that they can't just turn down the big issue. Here's our bill on funding the military for this year. And oh, I also put something in there about, subsidies for pig farmers in Alaska. Here's a subsidy for, wind turbines in Nevada. Just junk. The two-party systems especially cause a lot of problems because there's no real outside option. And in America, who really gets screwed over by this are the Christian socialists and the libertarians. As Christian socialists, you probably not even heard of because they're common in Europe. Those are people who are economically socialist but socially conservative. They would like to have a bigger government. They'd like to have more welfare, but they also are opposed to socially progressive agendas. They're opposed to abortion. They're opposed to homosexuality. They're opposed to stuff like that. Um, in America, you tend to see a little bit more of that with Catholics than you do Protestants. But there's plenty of people like that in this country. But they're forced to choose between one or the other. Either the economy is more important to them and they vote Democrat, or the social values are more important to them and they vote conservative, vote Republican, I mean. In European parliamentary systems, these people have their own parties, and then they always do very well in the elections. And then the flip side of that would be the libertarians. In Europe, they call them classical liberals. But your libertarians, they're usually economically free market, but they're socially liberal. You know, I want my gay rights, but I want to smoke dope, but I want lower taxes and less welfare. Well, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place too, aren't they? Because either you care more about the social aspect and you vote Democrat, or you care more about the economic aspect and you vote Republican. As it happens, I tend to notice that the Christian socialist types tend to, and again, it's something so alien to American politics that most people who would vote Christian socialist if they have the option just don't know that phrase in the first place. But most of those people, they tend to end up going with the society side, while the libertarians tend to end up going with the economy side. So both camps often wind up voting Republican. Although they're basically opposites of each other, they both wind up under the same Big Ten as a rule. That's becoming less true in recent years, though. So ultimately, economic theory gives guidelines for how to try to manage an economy, but political incentives are perverse, and what the government does has little relation to what it should do. There's a great deal of consensus among economists about how the economy works. Usually, when they disagree with each other, it comes down to quibbling over numbers. Do you really believe that the negative externalities from global warming are that big? Do you really believe that uh, the unemployment caused by a minimum wage is going to be that big? Right? They argue about degrees of effects. They argue about the magnitude of them, but they tend to agree about the basic logic. Do politicians listen to us, though? No. Do voters listen to us? No. But a government can be better or it can be worse. Kaplan, he criticized democracy, but he didn't say that a dictatorship was better. And if there's one thing that, most economists agree on nowadays, it's that democracies create wealthy countries. And we'll explore that in Unit 4. That's his Unit 6 because of it's another thing for me to fix. Democracies are going to yield wealthier societies because they better align the interests of the elite with the interests of the masses. Well, that's all I have for you out of Unit 2. In the next video, we'll start talking about Unit 3, business cycles. Get into macroeconomics.